Human dug the alien girl out of a frozen trap, but her elders called his rescue a violation. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. Jake Carson trudged through the thick snow, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The icy wind howled around him, stinging his skin as he carefully made his way through the desolate landscape. He had been tracking a distress signal for hours, his boots crunching through the snow with every step. The landscape before him was like something out of a nightmare, endless stretches of white, with jagged cliffs and frozen terrain as far as the eye could see. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to find, but the signal had come from somewhere deep in this wilderness. As he continued onward, the snowstorm worsened, reducing visibility to near zero. His heart raced as he pushed through the storm, the bitter cold seeping through his heavy jacket. Then, through the blinding snow, he saw it, a faint shape in the distance. At first, he thought it was a trick of the storm, but as he drew closer, he realized it was real. There, half buried in the snow, was the body of an alien girl, her green skin almost blending with the snow. She was trapped in a thick layer of ice, barely conscious, her limbs frozen stiff. Without hesitation, Jake moved forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he assessed the situation. She was still alive, but only just. Her eyes flickered open as he knelt beside her, her silver pupils locking with his, a look of confusion and fear in her gaze. She tried to speak, but the words were lost in the howling wind. Jake's hands moved quickly, using his survival knife to cut through the ice surrounding her. His gloves were soaked with cold, but he ignored the discomfort. Every second mattered. Finally, with a grunt of effort, he freed her from the trap, lifting her fragile form into his arms. Her body was cold, and he could feel the weight of her on his chest as he trudged back through the snow, each step taking every ounce of energy he had left. He couldn't leave her here, not like this. As they made their way toward shelter, Jake knew there was more at stake than just the alien girl's life. What had started as a simple rescue mission was about to turn into something much bigger. Unknown to him, the girl's people had their own rules, their own laws that Jake had unknowingly violated by saving her. The Elder Council would not take kindly to this, and Jake knew that trouble was just around the corner. But for now, all he cared about was getting her to safety. The storm raged on, but Jake's resolve grew stronger with every step. He would face whatever came next, but not today. Today, he had a life to save. As Jake finally made it back to his shelter, the storm started to ease, the wind dying down and the snow falling more gently. The small cabin was a welcome sight after the brutal journey through the frozen wilderness. Inside, Jake gently laid the alien girl down on a makeshift bed, his hands shaking slightly from the cold and exhaustion. He hurried to start a fire, the warmth of the flames soon filling the room and bringing some relief to both his body and the girl's. He pulled off his thick gloves and wiped his face, looking over at her as she lay motionless, her breathing shallow but steady. He had no idea what kind of creature she was, but he knew she wasn't human. Her features were unlike anything he'd ever seen before, green skin, silver eyes, and hair that shimmered with an almost ethereal glow. He could see the faint outline of her alien physiology under the torn remnants of her clothes. Despite her fragile appearance, there was something incredibly strong about her. Jake shook his head, trying to push away the thoughts swirling in his mind. His first priority was to make sure she was safe, to get her warm again. He grabbed his emergency medical kit, checking for any signs of injury as he carefully examined her. There were no visible wounds, but her body was still dangerously cold, her limbs stiff from the ice that had trapped her. Jake knew he had to act fast. He started to remove her icy clothing, replacing it with blankets from his own supplies, doing his best to warm her up. His mind raced as he tried to think of a solution. He had no idea where she came from, but the way she looked at him before she lost consciousness, there was a hint of gratitude, but also confusion, fear, and something else. Was it trust? Or was it just the need for survival? Jake sighed as he sat beside her, keeping the fire crackling in front of them. He knew there would be consequences for what he had done. He had broken some kind of rule, saved someone from death in a way that the alien society wouldn't understand. But in that moment, he didn't care. She was alive, and that was all that mattered. Hours passed, and Jake continued to watch over her, keeping the fire going and occasionally checking her temperature. His mind kept drifting back to the way she had looked at him. That strange, intense look that seemed to ask 1,000 questions without words. He had to admit, part of him was curious about her, who she was, where she came from, and why she had been trapped in the snow. His thoughts were interrupted when the girl suddenly stirred. Her silver eyes flickered open, and she looked around the small cabin, confused and disoriented. She blinked several times before her gaze settled on Jake. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a soft, melodic voice, she spoke. "Why did you save me?" Jake hesitated for a moment, unsure how to respond. He had no real explanation other than the fact that it was the right thing to do. "Because you were in trouble," he said simply. "I couldn't leave you out there to die." She studied him for a long time, her eyes scanning his face. Then, surprisingly, she nodded. "You are different from my people." Jake frowned, not understanding. "Different how?" She looked away, her gaze focused on the fire, as though trying to process her thoughts. "You saved me without asking anything in return. My people, they would never do such a thing." Jake didn't know what to say to that. He didn't know anything about her people or their ways, but in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was alive. "I just did what I thought was right," he replied. She turned back to him, her expression softening. "Maybe you are right," she said quietly. "Maybe you are more than just a human." Jake didn't know what she meant by that, but he smiled, relieved to see that she was no longer in pain. For the first time in what felt like hours, he allowed himself to relax. They were both safe for now. As the days passed, Jake continued to watch over Alia, helping her regain some strength. The cabin had become their sanctuary, a place of safety amidst the endless snow and ice. The alien girl, who had once been a stranger, now seemed to trust him more each day, though her silence often spoke volumes. She was recovering physically, but the emotional scars of what she had endured still lingered in her silver eyes. Despite their differences, Jake couldn't help but feel a connection to her, a bond forged through his act of saving her life. He had no idea who she was or where she came from, but something told him that her story was far more complicated than he could ever imagine. Every night, as the fire crackled and the cold winds howled outside, Jake would find himself staring into the flames, wondering what had led her to this frozen wasteland. Alia, for her part, had begun to speak more, her voice still soft but steady. She would often ask him questions about Earth, about his life, his world, his people. It was as if she was trying to understand what made him different from her own kind. "Tell me more about Earth," she asked one evening, her eyes watching him intently as she sat wrapped in blankets near the fire. "What is it like to live there?" Jake paused for a moment, unsure of how to answer. "It's different from here. It's warmer, for one thing," he said, his gaze distant as he thought of home. "We have forests, mountains, oceans, and cities full of people. But it's not always easy. There's war, poverty, and plenty of things to worry about." Alia seemed to contemplate this, her fingers tracing the edge of her blanket. "I have never seen such beauty," she said quietly, her voice almost wistful. "Where I come from, we are taught to seek power, to dominate. But there is no warmth, no beauty like what you describe." Jake looked at her, studying her features. He could see the sadness behind her words, the longing for something more than the cold, structured life she had known. "Not all humans are perfect," Jake said, his tone soft but firm. "We have our flaws, just like any other species. But we also have the capacity for kindness, for love, and for change. Maybe that's what makes us different." Alia turned her head to meet his gaze, her silver eyes searching his face as if trying to understand him better. "You are different from what I expected," she said, her voice carrying a hint of curiosity. "You have done something no one in my world would have ever done. You risked your life for mine." Jake shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I just did what felt right," he replied. You don't leave someone to die when you have the chance to help them. Alya studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Maybe there is more to humans than I have been taught. But the elders will not understand your actions. They will come for you. Jake frowned, the weight of her words settling in. He had been expecting this. He had already broken one of their laws by saving her, and it was only a matter of time before the consequences would catch up with him. I'm not afraid of them, he said, his voice steady. I didn't do it for their approval. Alya's expression softened, and for the first time since he had met her, he saw a flicker of something like admiration in her eyes. You are brave, she said quietly. But I fear for you. You have not seen the power of my people. Jake looked at her, a mixture of concern and curiosity in his gaze. What do you mean? Alya hesitated before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. The elders do not forgive easily. They will see you as a threat, and they will stop at nothing to punish you for your actions. I have seen it happen before. Jake didn't know how to respond to that. He didn't want to leave her, but he also knew he couldn't stay here forever, not with the danger looming on the horizon. He needed to figure out what to do next, and fast. As the night drew on, Jake's mind raced with possibilities, but one thing was clear: no matter what happened, he would protect Alya. He had to. She was the reason he had come this far, and now he couldn't turn back. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy calm. Jake knew the quiet wouldn't last long, but for now, the storm outside had died down, and the immediate danger had passed. Alya was recovering quickly, though her silence had returned, the weight of their situation settling between them. The fire in the small cabin crackled as Jake sat across from her, trying to process everything that had happened. His eyes occasionally flickered to Alya, who sat near the window, staring out into the snowy wilderness with an intensity that made him wonder what she was thinking. He had saved her life, but the price for that act of kindness might be higher than he could imagine. He had already broken a law by helping her, and from the way she spoke about her people, he knew the elders would not take this lightly. There was no telling what kind of punishment they would bring upon him once they found out. You should go, Alya said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Jake blinked, surprised by the words. What do you mean? He asked, his brow furrowing. She didn't look at him as she spoke, her gaze still fixed on the snow outside. You've done enough. They'll come for you, and when they do, they won't care that you helped me. Jake clenched his jaw, the thought of leaving her alone in this place gnawing at him. I can't just leave you, he said, his voice firm. You're not alone anymore. I promised I'd help you, and that means I'll stay. Alya turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze for the first time in what felt like forever. Her silver eyes were filled with something Jake couldn't quite place: fear, gratitude, and perhaps a hint of something deeper. You don't understand, she said softly. My people are not like yours. When they find out, they will punish you, and they will not care about your intentions. They will see you as a threat. And she stopped herself, as though she was about to say something she wasn't ready to share. Jake's heart ached as he saw the pain in her eyes. He didn't understand everything about her world, but he understood enough to know that she was right about one thing: staying here with him could put them both in danger. Still, the thought of leaving her was unbearable. I don't care what they think, Jake said, his voice steady. I'm not going anywhere. You're not going to face this alone. Alya's expression softened, though there was still a sadness in her gaze. I've never met anyone like you, she said quietly. You're willing to risk everything for someone like me, someone who doesn't belong in your world. Jake smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Maybe it's because I see something in you that I don't see in most people. You're not just some alien. You're a person. There was a long pause before Alya spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't know what you're saying. Jake's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Alya's eyes were distant again, and she turned her gaze back to the window, as though the words were too difficult to speak. You've saved my life, Jake. But my people, they won't let this go. And if you stay, you'll be marked as an enemy. Jake stood up, moving toward her. I don't care about that, he said firmly. I'll face whatever comes. But you're not alone. I won't let them take you. Alia turned her head to look at him, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and something else he couldn't quite understand. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly in the background, the only sound in the room. Jake could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, the knowledge that there were no easy answers. But one thing was certain, no matter what came next, he would stand by her. They would face the consequences together. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he couldn't abandon her now. Not after everything they had been through. Thank you, Alia said finally, her voice soft. For everything. Jake gave her a small nod. We're in this together. That's what matters. As the fire flickered and the storm outside raged on, Jake knew that whatever happened next, they would have to face it head-on. But for now, they had each other, and that would have to be enough. The days grew colder. As Jake and Alia remained holed up in the cabin. The storm had passed, but the weather was still unforgiving, and it became clear that they couldn't stay hidden forever. Jake had built a small shelter outside the cabin, a temporary place to stash supplies in case they needed to leave quickly. As much as he wanted to keep Alia safe, he knew they couldn't stay here indefinitely. The elders of her people would eventually find them, and Jake wasn't sure what kind of danger he was putting her in by staying so close. But there was something inside him that refused to let go, a determination to protect her no matter the cost. Alia had been recovering physically, but the emotional toll of the situation was still evident. She spent most of her time looking out the window, lost in thought, her eyes distant and full of pain. Jake knew it was because of what had happened to her people, the rigid structure they adhered to, and the laws they enforced. Her entire life had been shaped by those laws, and now she was living with the consequences of breaking them. One morning, as Jake was working outside to gather firewood, Alia approached him. Her movements were slower than usual, and she appeared exhausted. He paused and looked up, noticing the change in her demeanor. What is it? He asked, his voice soft with concern. Alia stopped in front of him, her silver eyes meeting his. We need to leave, she said, her voice calm but filled with an urgency Jake hadn't heard before. The elders will be coming soon. They know where we are. Jake's heart sank at the words. He had known this day would come, but hearing it out loud made it feel all too real. How do you know? He asked, stepping closer to her. Alia glanced over her shoulder, her gaze darting to the edge of the forest where the trees met the snow. I can feel it, she said quietly. The air is different. My people, they know. It's only a matter of time before they come for me. Jake exhaled sharply, trying to push back the fear that was rising in his chest. He had to remain calm. He had to be the one to make the decisions now. We don't have much time, he said, his voice firm as he turned toward the cabin. We'll pack up and leave. You can't stay here. Alia nodded, but there was something in her expression that gave Jake pause. What is it? He asked, his voice gentler now. Alia hesitated, looking away for a moment before speaking again. I'm afraid for you, she admitted. If you come with me, you'll be marked as an enemy of my people. You don't know what they're capable of. Jake's heart tightened at her words, but he refused to back down. I'm not afraid of them, he said, his voice steady. I'll protect you, no matter what. For the first time in days, Alia looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something almost vulnerable. She didn't say anything, but Jake saw it in her eyes, the unspoken trust she was beginning to place in him. They worked quickly, gathering the supplies they would need to escape. Jake didn't know where they would go, but he knew they couldn't stay here. The cabin, once a place of refuge, now felt like a trap. As they packed their belongings, Alia seemed lost in her thoughts again, her movements slower, more deliberate. Jake wanted to ask her what was going through her mind, but he didn't. He knew she was struggling with the decision as much as he was. Finally, after what felt like hours, they were ready. The snow outside was still thick, and the cold was biting, but Jake knew they had to move now. Let's go, he said softly, turning to lead the way. Alia followed him, her footsteps barely making a sound in the snow. They didn't speak as they left the cabin behind, each of them lost in their own thoughts. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was waiting for them. The world outside had changed, and now, so had their lives. Alia had shown him a side of the universe he had never imagined, and now, they would have to face it together. What awaited them was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they couldn't run forever. They would have to face the elders, and whatever consequences came with it. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. The journey was harder than Jake had expected. The snow was relentless, a heavy blanket of white that stretched out for miles, and the wind bit through his clothes like 1,000 tiny daggers. With each step, the weight of what they were running from pressed down on him. He could feel Alia's presence beside him, but she had grown quieter in the last few hours, her pace slower, as though she was struggling with something inside her. Jake glanced at her, worried. "Alia, are you okay?" She didn't respond immediately, her silver eyes focused on the horizon, her face expressionless. It was hard for Jake to tell what was going on in her mind. He had saved her life, but now they were both on the run, and the uncertainty of it all was beginning to wear on them both. "I'm fine," she said at last, her voice soft. But the hesitation in her words told him otherwise. Jake wanted to press further, to ask what was really going on, but he knew better. He had to keep moving, and so did she. They couldn't afford to stop for long. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow, and the temperature was quickly dropping. They needed to find shelter before the night fully set in. "We should find a place to camp for the night," Jake said, scanning their surroundings. Alia nodded but didn't speak. The silence between them had become heavy, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. After a few more minutes of walking, Jake spotted a small cave in the distance, its mouth barely visible behind a thick cluster of trees. It was their best option, and they headed toward it without another word. Once inside, the cold still clung to their clothes, and Jake immediately set to work gathering whatever firewood he could find. Alia stood by, her gaze distant as she looked out toward the darkening world outside. When Jake had the fire going, he pulled out his small stove to heat up some food. The warmth of the fire felt like a blessing, but it couldn't push away the unease that lingered between them. Alia finally spoke again, her voice quiet in the stillness of the cave. "Jake. I don't know how much longer I can keep running," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Jake's heart sank at the words, but he kept his face neutral, unwilling to show his own growing concern. "We'll figure it out," he said, though even he didn't know what that meant. "One step at a time." Alia turned to look at him then, her silver eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before: vulnerability. She was afraid. "I've never been out here before," she admitted. "I've never known what it's like to be free. To not have rules, to not have a place in my society. I don't know what to do." Jake softened, his hand instinctively reaching out to her, though he wasn't sure why. "You're not alone, Alia," he said gently. "You have me. And we'll figure it out together. We don't need to follow the rules of your people anymore. You can make your own path now." She looked down, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her blanket. "But what if my people come after you?" she asked, her voice small. "What if they hurt you for helping me?" Jake took a deep breath, his resolve firming. "I've made my choice, Alia. I'm not afraid of them. You're worth it." Alia was quiet for a long time, and for a moment, Jake thought she might say something more. But she didn't. Instead, she simply nodded and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her eyes flickering briefly toward the fire before looking away again. Jake let her be, understanding that she needed time. He couldn't promise her that everything would be easy, that they wouldn't face danger again, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't leave her. They had made it this far together, and whatever came next, they would face it together too. As the fire crackled in the cave, Jake couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. They had made it through the worst of the storm, and though the road ahead was uncertain, he wasn't about to give up on Alia now. Not when she had become so much more than just someone he had saved. She had become someone he cared about deeply, someone worth fighting for. As the days passed, Jake and Alia continued their journey through the wilderness, the landscape shifting from the snow-covered mountains to a dense, quiet forest. The trees seemed to close in around them, their thick trunks standing like silent sentinels in the dim light. The weather had improved slightly, but the cold still nipped at their skin, a constant reminder of the harsh world they were trying to escape. Despite the quiet beauty of their surroundings, the weight of what lay ahead hung over them both. Alia had grown quieter with each passing day, her silence more than just the result of their circumstances. Jake could feel the strain in her, the deep-seated fear that she tried so hard to hide. He knew that part of it was for him, the danger he was in because of his decision to help her. But the rest, he knew, was something far more complicated. Alia wasn't just running from her people, she was running from a life that had shaped every part of who she was. The elders, the laws, the unspoken rules, everything she had been taught to believe was now in direct conflict with what Jake had done. She had told him once that her people wouldn't understand kindness, wouldn't understand why he had saved her. But Jake refused to believe that. He didn't believe that all the people she knew could be so cold, so heartless. Jake, Alia's voice cut through the silence, soft but filled with a quiet intensity. He turned toward her, meeting her silver eyes. "We need to talk," she said, her gaze fixed on him. Her tone was different than before, more open, as though she was finally willing to share something she had kept buried for too long. "About what?" Jake asked, his voice gentle, trying to read the change in her. Alia took a deep breath, her fingers tightly gripping the fabric of her coat. "About my people," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The ones who follow the laws. The ones who are coming for us." Jake nodded, knowing this conversation had been inevitable. "What do you need to tell me?" he asked, his voice calm but with an underlying urgency. Alia hesitated for a moment, as though the weight of her words was too heavy to bear. "They will never forgive me for what I've done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And they will never forgive you for saving me. In their eyes, I've broken the most sacred law. And anyone who helps me, who aids me, becomes an enemy." Jake stepped closer to her, his expression serious. "I've made my choice, Alia," he said firmly. "You don't have to worry about me. I won't turn my back on you." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "But you don't understand," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "You don't know what they're capable of. My people, they don't just punish. They take everything. They will come after you, after anyone who's helped me." Jake didn't know what to say to that. He had known the risks when he made the decision to save her, but hearing it from her now made it feel real, made the danger feel much closer than it had before. "We'll figure it out," he said, though even he wasn't sure how. He could feel the weight of her words, the fear in her voice, but there was no turning back. He had promised to protect her, and that was a promise he intended to keep. Alia's expression softened as she looked at him, her lips pressing into a tight line. "I don't want to put you in danger," she said, her voice full of regret. "But I can't go back. I can't go back to that life." Jake placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "I'm with you," he said simply. "We're in this together, Alia. Whatever comes, we face it together." For the first time in days, Alia seemed to relax, her shoulders lowering slightly as she took in his words. She didn't say anything at first, but Jake saw the small flicker of relief in her eyes. She nodded, a faint, grateful smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you," she whispered. Jake gave her a small nod, the fire of determination in his chest burning brighter. They had a long road ahead of them, and the danger was real, but for the first time, Jake felt a sense of clarity. He had made a choice, and that choice was her. No matter the cost, he would protect her. Together, they would face whatever came next. The wind rustled the trees above them, and the darkness of the forest seemed to press in around them, but for Jake and Alia, there was nothing left but the road ahead. They were in this together, and that was all that mattered. The journey grew more treacherous with each passing day. The dense forest gave way to rocky hills and sharp cliffs, and the biting wind seemed to follow them, relentless in its pursuit. Jake and Alia pushed forward, determined to put distance between themselves and the life they were fleeing. Though their surroundings had become more hostile, they had no choice but to continue. They couldn't stop now, not when they were so close to finding something resembling freedom. But the weight of the situation began to take its toll on both of them. Alia had become more withdrawn, her silences growing longer, and Jake noticed the way her shoulders hunched with the weight of her thoughts. He couldn't blame her. She had been through so much, and now, the fear of what was coming next seemed to consume her. One evening, as they set up camp near a small creek, Jake tried to make small talk, anything to break the tension that had settled between them. "We're getting closer," he said, adjusting the campfire. "It won't be long before we're out of this mountain range." Alia didn't respond right away. She was sitting across the fire, staring into the flames with a distant look in her eyes. Her silver hair glinted in the firelight, but it was the sadness in her eyes that Jake couldn't shake. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but heavy with emotion. "What happens if we make it? What happens if we escape?" Jake paused, not sure how to answer. He had been focusing so much on survival that he hadn't allowed himself to think about the future. "We start over," he said after a long moment. "We make a new life for ourselves. No laws, no people telling us what we can or can't do." Alia's gaze flickered to him, but there was something in her eyes that made Jake feel like she didn't fully believe him. "And if your people come after us?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What if they find us?" Jake looked at her, the flickering fire reflecting in his eyes. "We face them," he said, his voice steady. "Together. We've made it this far, haven't we?" Alia looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. "I don't know if I can keep running forever," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can keep running from everything I've known. I feel like I'm losing myself." Jake's heart clenched at the pain in her voice. He couldn't imagine what she was going through, torn between her people and her desire for freedom. But he knew one thing, he wasn't going to let her face this alone. "Alia," he said softly, "you're not alone. I'm right here. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." She met his gaze then, her silver eyes filled with gratitude and a vulnerability that Jake hadn't seen before. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have again," she said quietly. "Hope." Jake smiled, though it was a sad smile. "That's what I'm here for," he said, "to give you hope." The fire crackled between them, the warmth of the flames contrasting with the cold night air. Alia seemed to relax slightly, but Jake could feel the tension still lingering in her, the uncertainty about what lay ahead. They didn't talk much after that, both of them lost in their thoughts. Jake knew they couldn't stop for long. Every moment they wasted was a moment closer to danger, but for tonight, they had peace. As he lay down on his bedroll, the sound of the rushing creek in the distance and the rustling of leaves above them, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. He didn't know what it was, but he knew they couldn't keep running forever. He had promised Alia that he would protect her, and he would keep that promise, no matter what. The road ahead was uncertain, and the fear of what might happen next loomed over them both. But for the first time in a long while, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. They had each other, and as long as they did, they could face whatever came next. The following days were filled with a quiet tension. Jake and Alia continued their journey, though the weight of their situation never fully left them. They traveled through dense forests, crossed frozen streams, and climbed steep hills, always moving forward, always looking over their shoulders. The days blurred together as they pushed on, their destination unknown but the urgency to reach it growing with each passing hour. As they walked, Jake tried his best to keep the mood light, cracking jokes or pointing out the beauty of the world around them, but Alia remained quiet, her mind clearly elsewhere. He understood, she was struggling. Every step they took brought them closer to an uncertain future, and it was hard to keep hope alive when they didn't know what awaited them. One morning, as they broke camp, Jake noticed Alia lingering behind, staring out at the horizon. The sky was a pale blue, the sun just beginning to rise. He approached her cautiously, not wanting to disturb her but knowing they had to keep moving. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Alia didn't turn to look at him right away. For a long moment, she was silent, her gaze fixed on something far in the distance. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I keep thinking about what you said," she began, her eyes still distant. About making a new life. About finding freedom. Jake watched her closely, knowing this was a moment of vulnerability for her. And, he prompted gently. Alia turned to face him, her silver eyes meeting his with a mix of uncertainty and determination. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to live outside of everything I've known. Everything I've been taught. How do you even begin to change everything you've ever believed? Jake took a deep breath, his heart aching for her. He knew how hard it must be to throw away everything she had grown up with, to step into the unknown with no guarantee of safety. But he also knew that she had more strength in her than she realized. You start with one step, he said, his voice steady. And you take another. You don't have to have all the answers right now. We don't need to have it all figured out. We just need to keep moving forward. Alia's gaze softened, and for the first time in days, Jake saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. What if I fail? She asked, her voice trembling. What if I'm not strong enough? Jake smiled, stepping closer to her. You won't fail, he said firmly. And you're stronger than you think. You've already made it this far. And I'm with you. We're in this together. Alia nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a tight line as if trying to convince herself of what he said. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Okay, she said finally, her voice more resolute than before. Let's keep moving. Jake gave her an encouraging smile, and together they packed up their camp, ready to face whatever came next. They didn't know where the road would take them, but for the first time in a long while, Alia seemed to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could carve out a new life for themselves. As they set off once again, the weight of the world felt a little lighter, and the journey ahead didn't seem quite so impossible. They had each other, and that was enough for now.